One of the most famous and complex philosophers of the 19th century is certainly a man by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. He had created a complex set of philosophical concepts. In this video, we are going to closely examine perhaps his most important one, the will to power. Without further delay, let's begin. Oh, power! Who does not want it? Who does not desire it? In his early works, Nietzsche, such as Human All Too Human, The Dawn, and The Gay Science, provides us with the first insight into what later would come to be defined in his future works as a will to power. As the 1880s began, Nietzsche began to speak of the desire for power, Machtgelust. This concept was rather than a philosophical one, a psychological one. The reason why the powerful man is grateful is this: his benefactor, through the benefit he confers, has mistaken and intruded into the sphere of the powerful man. Now the latter, in return, penetrates into the sphere of the benefactor by the act of gratitude. By asking for help, one gives the impression of powerlessness, as he is unable to solve the problem himself. This gives power over such a person, as now something worth a trouble for another human being is outside his reach, and only the intervention of oneself can give it to another human. That's why, by expressing gratitude, one is pushing the power back to himself, as a simple thank you gives the impression that somebody did something for you, just as the servant, not the other way around. In that sense, gratitude might represent the desire for dominating the other person, or even perhaps revenge. One may actually see that Nietzsche's view on gratitude has a solid basis in nature. The vampire bats, for example, according to new studies, can form relationships and help each other by, for example, feeding the sick friend with a blood that they had attained for themselves. However, such an act is not an altruistic good nature of a species, but the way to form social hierarchies and pursue their own individual interests. That is because the now gifted bat is obligated to do the same when his benefactor will be in need himself. Such an example is not irrelevant here, as it proves that ultimately altruism is just another form of serving the interests of oneself, and thus cannot really exist. This will be relevant later. Everyone is superior in one thing. In civilized circumstances, everyone feels superior to the everyone else in at least one way. This is the basis of the general goodwill. Inasmuch as everyone is someone who under certain conditions can be of help and need, therefore, feel no shame in allowing himself to be helped. In another aphorism, Nietzsche describes the effort of people to arouse pity in a similar manner to that of the latter one. Ask yourself whether that ready complaining and whimpering, that making a show of misfortune, does not at bottom aim at making the spectators miserable. The pity which the spectators then exhibit is, insofar, a consolation for the weak and suffering, in that the latter recognize certain that they possess still want power in spite of their weakness, the power of giving pain. Such a view might be a result of Schopenhauer's influence over Nietzsche. It would, however, dramatically change, as now he does not consider, at the moment, the so-called desire for power a good thing, and he speaks of it in a negative manner. In his later works, Nietzsche sees that the desire for this power, be it in the form of humility, pity, gratitude, or even pride and anger, is not any justification of the following emotions and actions, but the reason itself. In other words, these emotional states are not a cause of the desire for power, but the direct result of it. As in the strange paradox, the negation of the desire for power is a manifestation of it, as it could only be explained in the terms of power. Such views influenced Giovanni Gentili and Mussolini, As fascists themselves like to put it, the power justifies itself. But coming back to the Nietzsche, his revelation of this phenomena might lie in the dawn of the day. Power, which has greatly suffered both in deed and in thought, is better than powerlessness, which only meets with kind treatment. Such was the Greek way of thinking. In other words, the feeling of power was prized more highly by them than any mere utility or fair renown. Those who possess truly great power will not indulge themselves in the sadism and oppression of the weak. Only the man of weak spirit, without any real power, will make others suffer on purpose for the sake of his enjoyment, as the power to inflict suffering is one of the few he possesses. In contrast to the man of power, or this what would later be in Nietzsche's work called Übermensch, with such self-explanation of the psychological needs, all of them could be thus reduced to one desire, the desire of power. This lies in the contrast to both the traditional Platonian and Christian view of human desire and the later explanations such as the desire for pleasure presented by Sigmund Freud, also known as pleasure principle. Nietzsche is not, however, on a road to find the basic universal principle that guides human psychology, and is instead on a road to find a meaning of one life, based not on external or material, but the internal life of a person. In a great coming of inspiration, Nietzsche wrote "Thus Spoke Zarathustra," in which the concept of the will to power really kicks in. He writes, "Only where there is life, there is also will, not will to live, but will to power. There is much that life esteems more highly than life itself, but out of the esteeming itself speaks the will to power. Thus life taught me." Nietzsche was primarily preoccupied not with the enforcement of one will to others, but on oneself. The will to power is a dynamic force in continuous becoming and striving, manifesting itself in the encounter with obstacles. It is the expression of self-realization, becoming who you truly are. This is directly in contrast what most people want and the way they act. Their main desire is always to enforce their power onto others, be it in an economical, cultural, or sexual way. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Zarathustra embodies not the power to rule others, but is a representation of self-overcoming and the power upon oneself. This self-overcoming in Nietzschean philosophy is seen as a force of self-destruction, not the self-improvement. It destroys in order to create. For example, to overcome physical addiction is not to improve it, but to destroy it. Self-overcoming might be defined as a force capable of destroying the resistance alongside the road. Such resistance might be both the material, just as in case of physical addictions, as mentioned earlier, but it might also be a spiritual one. To overcome the spiritual resistance is to get yourself out of the grasp of outside power upon oneself's mind. Such power may present itself in different forms, be it conformism and socially accepted things such as a morality of the slave enforced upon one by the environment. At the same time, because the self-overcoming is a force of destruction, not creation, it lacks any desire to lead others, as to lead is to create new ways for people and enforce them. Zarathustra expresses such outlook in the following manner: "I lack the lion's voice for all commanding." In this way, he insists that he would rather not lead others, as they should be capable of leading themselves instead. This might be seen as a warning to not let the so-called nonconformists lead the masses, as by joining the nonconformist group, the individual will automatically become conformist in relation to that group instead of broader society. The similar critique might be applied, according to Nietzsche, to classical socially accepted morality, as it is in its essence a simple form of controlling the behavior of others and the ultimate sign of conformism. Nietzsche instead, in Antichrist, proposes different solutions to a problem of good and evil. What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome. Nietzsche completely rejects morality as an objective universal construct, and instead builds his morality on relativism. The good thing is that what affects the power in a positive way, such as Nietzsche described it, heightened power, is however only relevant to one specific person. Any increase of one power is only psychologically relevant to oneself, and is thus always subjective, as the increase of power is not dependent upon any universal factor, as one may see, putting aside that such view justifies murder, rape, and other things, because if they increase power, then following the definition of good by Nietzsche, they are ultimately good. The key problem on an individual level is self-commanding. On paper, self-commanding is pretty simple. However, in practice, it is not as easy as it may sound. In fact, many people embody what Nietzsche calls the last man, the antithesis of the Übermensch. The last man is someone who gives oneself to social norms and regulations without a second thought. It is someone who lives a mediocre life stuck in his comfort zone and is submissive to social norms and regulations. The last men are thus people who are mere subjects to a herd mentality. The Nietzsche, however, is not writing for those sort of people. His main audience consists of those individuals ready to denounce their conformity and take risks in stepping out of their comfort zones. For, believe me, the secret of harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. Instead of running away from reality, one should be able to face it, as long-term happiness could only be a result of strength and acceptance of reality, and thus suffering. As one of the most famously known words of Nietzsche sum it up, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. To struggle and overcome the resistance is to grow as a person. He who climbs upon the highest mountains laughs at all tragedies, real or imaginary. By that, Nietzsche tries to teach us that, after all, suffering is not a problem by itself. To climb a mountain is to suffer hardships and potentially get hurt or even die. But once you reach the top of the mountain, you can see a beautiful world beneath you. When one overcomes suffering, he would see that it wasn't as bad as it may seem. After all, you are standing here alive, and throughout your experience, you are also wiser. Those who fail to accept suffering as an essential part of life would be miserable. The same goes to people who, out of fear or laziness, are too afraid to step outside their comfort zones. To realize one's self-power is thus to see life as it really is and be happy about it. Not run away from challenges, but to face them. And this way, we had come to yet another important concept coined by Nietzsche, the sublimation. Nietzsche believed that the unfulfilled desires of a person might find attainment in something else. For example, the unrealized need for affection might come to become an inspiration for fulfillment of one's creative needs. One of his main critics of Christianity is that it did not sublimate the instincts, but rather tries to denounce them, as the instincts are what makes us human beings. It is against human nature itself, contrary to the will to power, in which instincts are the main driving force in humans. This contrast of the abjuration, repudiation, and extirpation of passions on the one side and their control and sublimation on the other is one of the most important points in Nietzsche's entire philosophy. A strong-willed person will have no problem with delaying his gratification or trying to fulfill his needs in other ways. A weakly spirited man, however, would be unable to accept that his needs might not be satisfied and would become bitter and angry because of that. A strong spirit does not ignore impulses, but rather uses them in a different manner to suit his higher needs. That's why Nietzsche argues so many great minds come to be highly uninterested in women in particular, as their sexual urges find a fulfillment in their intellectual works, or simply in hands of prostitutes, as in the case of Nietzsche himself. Making music is another way of making children. The will to power does not exist in the vacuum, however. It has its direct antagonist, and that is the decadence. Everywhere where there is growth must come a moment in which the progress is going to be reversed. Such is a law of nature. Our beautiful sculptures and architecture with time will gradually erode. Our sun's existence will one day come to an end. The same applies even to the whole of our universe. This reversal of progress is known as a degeneracy in the case of morality and human beings. This degeneracy takes a specific form known as decadence. But what if pleasure and pain should be so closely connected that he who wants the greatest possible amount of the one must also have the greatest possible amount of the other? That he who wants to experience the heavenly high jubilation must also be ready to be sorrowful unto death. Such is this dualism that everywhere where there is progress, the decadence must follow. How one faces the decadence? Well, he needs to treat it as yet another obstacle on his way to will to power. He needs to overcome the decadence in himself and later change his environment in such a way that the decadence in it would not cripple his own growth. Indeed, the one who shot at truth with the words "will to existence" did not hit it. This will does not exist. For what is not can not will, but what is in existence, how could still will to exist? Only where life is there also will, but not will to life instead. Thus I teach you, will to power. Nietzsche was himself a staunch anti-Darwinian. Darwin proposed that we evolve through natural selection. Herbert Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest, and also applied Darwinism to social basics. If you are interested in Herbert Spencer's views, I made a separate video on that subject. Coming back to Nietzsche, he believed that the reduction of one existence to a mere survival and reproduction is an insult to human existence. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche writes, "To will to preserve oneself is the expression of the distress, of a limitation of the genuinely basic drive of life, which aims at the expansion of power, and in this willing frequently risks and even sacrifices self-preservation. The struggle for existence is only an exception, a temporary restriction of the life will. The great and small struggle always turns upon superiority, upon growth and expansion, upon power, in accordance with the will to power, which is the will of life." The existence for Nietzsche is not an act of self-preservation, but the will to overcome internal struggle and increase the power of the individual. For Nietzsche, everything struggles for almighty power that justifies itself. Beyond Good and Evil has the most references to the will to power. Thus, we need to use it to fully understand Nietzsche's stance on what he calls the will to existence. It can be shown most clearly for every living thing that it does everything not in order to preserve itself, but to become more. Psychologists should think before putting down the instinct of self-preservation as the cardinal instinct of an organic being. A living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent results. Putting aside the fundamental misunderstanding of the Darwin theory of evolution, he concludes that every living being strives to grow in some way. Humans are no different. They strive for wealth, status, and strength. Nietzsche, rather than seeing this from the Darwinian perspective as means by which organism increases his chances of passing the sexual selection with best results, he sees this as yet another manifestation of the will to power in life. Nietzsche was also critical of philosophers' desire to seek universal truth, calling it a will to truth. Will to truth you call that which drives you and makes you lustful, you wisest ones? Will to thinkability of all beings, that's what I call your will. You first want to make all beings thinkable, because you doubt with proper suspicion whether it is even thinkable. But for you it shall behave and bend. Thus, your will wants it. It shall become smooth and subservient of the spirit, as its mirror and reflection. This is your entire will, your wisest ones. As a will to power, and even when you speak of good and evil and of valuations, you still want to create the world before which you could kneel. This is your ultimate hope and intoxication. Above all, however, he was critical in regard to the philosophy of his former mentor, Arthur Schopenhauer. Long before Nietzsche had begun his work, Schopenhauer coined a concept of so-called will to live, that could be defined as any being, an irrational blind intense impulse without knowledge, that drives instinctive behaviors, causing an endless insatiable striving in human existence without which nature could not exist. Contrary to Darwin, despite the similarities to self-preservation, biological behaviors of any specimen, this concept is purely metaphysical. This insatiable striving in human existence is similar to greed. We want certain things, we desire them, but once we have obtained them, the satisfaction would soon be gone, and we will yet again desire different things. This endless cycle is a source of human suffering, as it is impossible to satisfy one's desires, and thus be happy. We remain in a constant state of suffering and restlessness to satisfy our desires, until we inevitably die. That's why this philosophy is a pessimistic one. Nietzsche, however, rejects this will to live as yet another obstacle on a path to power over oneself. For Arthur Schopenhauer, suffering is something bad, and because fundamentally human existence is a suffering, our lives are meaningless. For Nietzsche, however, suffering isn't something bad. It is a thing that helps us grow as a person, and thus must be embraced as a way to better oneself. He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster. And if thou gaze long into an abyss, the abyss will also gaze into thee. This famous quote from Nietzsche has many interpretations, but one of the least known and most interesting perhaps is that Nietzsche here speaks directly about Schopenhauer. As his former mentor was struggling with overcoming the monsters who were suffering and the lack of objective meaning in human life, unable to overcome them, he stared into the abyss of nihilism and pessimism and yielded to its power. The word sin from within, it would simply be will to power, and nothing else. One may think that such view is an interpretation of the will to power as a metaphysical concept, in which the will is a subject to some omnipotent driving force in the humans. However, such view would contradict Nietzsche's previous works, as he was an opponent to metaphysics. Such interpretation thus is probably incorrect. Many argue that Nietzsche's will to power is not a metaphysical concept, but rather a psychological hypothesis. Martin Heidegger's works continue to have an enormous influence on how Nietzsche's notion of the will to power is interpreted, as a traditional metaphysical unity. However, there is a crucial distinction to be made in terms of metaphysics. Wherever Nietzsche rejects metaphysics, it is only the Platonic Christian tradition in which being is understood as fixed and static, such as Plato's world of forms or the Christian concept of heaven. In other words, Nietzsche is not against metaphysics per se, but against Platonic interpretation of it. This means that Nietzsche purposely constructed the concept of the will to power in such a way to contradict Platonian interpretation, so in some sense it may be considered a sick joke from the side of a great philosopher. Nietzsche's power is always relative. It cannot exist without any relation to another power. There are no first or last things, as everything exists only in subjective relation to each other. So one may conclude that reality is a dynamic construct. So worlds, universe and chaos should basically mean the same thing, as the changes in relations between subjects are too complex and numerous to be controlled in any serious manner by any force. This may serve as an explanation why Nietzsche was opposed to the idea of implying oneself power on others. The reality is simply too complex and interconnected to really have power over another being. The only way in which society can function is thus the subjugation of relative power of its members, not involuntarily, but voluntarily, to another power. That is at least the individualistic interpretation of Nietzsche used by, for example, objectivists. There also exists a totalist, collectivist interpretation of Nietzsche's will to power. Dynamic structure of reality implies that power must be understood as necessary striving for more power. Power is a necessary striving to expand itself and is only power insofar as it can maintain itself against the other powers and strives to predominate over them. Thus, all powers will try to dominate each other and the strongest power will always win in the end. Thus, we must embrace the total power of a group to dominate in advance other groups and powers before they do the same to us. Such interpretation was and still is used, for example, by National Socialists and Fascists. Regardless of which of this interpretation is correct, in Nietzsche's worldview nothing has existence and meaning outside the game of power relations. Because of this, there is no withdrawal from this game. This chaos is not an obstacle that we have to overcome to survive or make our life easier. It is also a main positive driving force of human existence. It is the basis of all creation and creativity. Without it, nothing original or novel could emerge. One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. As one may see, philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche is certainly extremely complex, and yet the will to power is just a mere one of three essential elements of it. The will to power is not a mere metaphysical concept, but it puts human effort at the center of itself. To have the so-called will to power is to be able to control oneself. It does not lie in military might and wealth, but within oneself. To conclude, the will to power can be thus simply understood as the self-discipline. Without it, we are mere slaves to our desires and moods, but with it, nothing can drag us down. If you like this video and perhaps would like to get to know more about philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche in the future, or you are simply interested in philosophy and history in general, then please consider subscribing to the channel. I might have a power over the making of this video, but I do not have one when it comes to a YouTube algorithm. Also, special thanks to everybody for 100 subscribers. See you all next time.